Hey everybody, welcome to the Luthiers podcast. I'm Paul Rhoney.
I'm Jason Rodgers.
And this week is the beginning of a two-parter.
Two-part.
That's right. Yeah, well, Jason, do you want to tell them about the survey again?
Yeah. Again, thanks to all of you who have been filling out the survey. You find that in the podcast description. It's also, you can probably find it in the Facebook community. It's under one of the topics there. And we've gotten some great info back from you, the listeners, you, the guitar builders. And you know already that our number one topic for people's concerns, things that were challenging people, was finishing. Number two was net construction, but then coming in third place is electronics. Mm-hmm. And electronics can be very, very daunting to some people because sometimes they just don't understand how it works. And then there's all this soldering and stuff involved, and
Yeah, I mean, some people, including me, I totally admit that electronics in general are not my strong suit. I'm going to bring in about as much as I can here. But I got to say, you really went out of your way and did a whole bunch of research. I mean, you bring your own experience to the table, right, which is no small amount here. But I just have to commend you for all the research that you did here to bring some of this information to everyone, because we got a lot to cover.
It's a lot, and that's why it's ended up being two-part episodes.
Yeah, so much so you might hear us make reference to talking about things later, and what we mean is what we mean might mean the next episode, because we're recording these things back to back, and they'll come out separately. But we ended up with so much to talk about that we had to split it in two.
Yeah.
Let's see, our first topic here is just going to be about sort of wiring rigs in general. We're not going to get too detailed on some of the other workings, but we'll get to that. So this is all about wiring. You ready to go? You ready to do this? Go. All right. From our Luthiers Facebook community, Levi Jones asks, what are some of the most interesting wiring mods you've heard of?
Mm-hmm.
And from Instagram, Judson Wall asks, what are your personal favorite wiring schemes? If you were making a stock build to sell down the line, what wiring schemes would you use to try and attract the broadest range of customers? Have you tried wirings that you thought would be cool but weren't crazy when it came to practical use or functionality in the end? Conversely, are there wirings mods that you think are underrated? All good questions.
Good questions, yeah. And so it starts from, I think all of that starts from sort of an assumption that maybe people have kind of experienced all that they are willing to experience with the standard wiring rigs of your typical guitars. Mm-hmm. So maybe Fender 5-way, you've played that out and you're ready to try something new, or you've the 3-way on a Gibson, you've played that out and you're ready to try something new. And over the however many decades that people have been messing around with their own wiring, there's been a lot of stuff that's been tried, and it's there's some cool resources out there. You're going to find this in the podcast description. Go check out guitarelectronics.com. Guitar Electronics is a general resource. They've got some really great schematics there. Very, very easy to sort and to search through to find, single, humbucker, single, humbucker, all sorts of different combinations of pickups and tone controls and stuff. Also, go check out telemodders.com. That's TELEMODDERS, telemodders. This is specifically Telecaster mods.
But those guys be crazy.
Yeah, right. There's also another cool website that I found. It's called 1728.org. And there's more ideas here than you'll know what to do with. I mean, some of them are really simple mods. Some of them are just like swapping the leads on one pickup and giving yourself, like an out of phase type of sound. Some of them are more involved, asking you to, get a whole new, selector switch, and do some rather significant soldering on your, and all this stuff. You need to be very confident that you can dive into your guitar control and do this stuff without destroying it, because and bad solder iron technique can ruin components. You can burn out capacitors. You can
totally.
melt the guts of a tone pot or something like that. So you got to be careful. So the word interesting. What's interesting? Some of them are interesting, but may not always be useful. Some of the early, I think, mods that were done on guitars, going back to that Telecaster idea, that was a three-way switch. And there was a time when people just realized, as they were switching between position 1, 2, and 3, that, hey, if I stop halfway, wait a minute, I get a mix of both of the positions here. And so people started going into their guitars and modding just that three-way blade switch, and ending up with, now, instead of 1, 2, and 3, now it's 1, 3, 5, and there's 2 and 4 in between there.
I thought that was more a Stratocaster thing with you said Telecaster.
But I'm pretty sure that it originally started with people finding that in between on the Telecaster. I could be totally wrong on the history of that.
I definitely know what you're talking about. People definitely did that.
Yeah, and I don't know if they found.
Three-way.
Yeah, I don't know if they found that if the Strat had the 5-way first, and then they went back to the Tele and said, "Hey, can we go in between?" Or if it was.
Well, the Strat definitely had a 3-way at first, and then eventually got a 5-way.
Yeah.
Because of what you're talking about, and the Telecaster, I think, people may have done the same thing, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, we have to go research. I seem to remember that's what I've read. Of course, there's so much stuff that's lost in history, and so much stuff that's lost in the mythology and lore.
Sure.
So just messing around with different switching options. I don't know, stock wiring setups. I build a lot of humbucker combinations. I like options where you can do some coil splits. So like your 2 and your 4, or like, inside single coils or something like that. Those give you some really cool options. I've built with the 1 3-way toggle plus 2 mini switches that allow you to take one humbucker and drop it to a single coil. And so you've got the 3-way plus the 2 mini switches. That gives you, I think it's like a total of 8 different combinations. And so that's a really cool way to go about finding out, like, how would I want to put this into a 5-way switch, or which ones would be useful. I don't know, what have you used most commonly? What have you found most sort of utilitarian?
For me, I'm a very much have always been just a very keep it simple kind of a person and builder, and I like, I've even had some of my personal guitars. I took all the electronics out. I had pickups wired straight to output because that's how simple I wanted it. You know, but for just like stock wiring for sort of commercial use, for the idea of like, hey, I'm going to market this guitar and try to sell as many as I can, kind of a thing. For me, it's always just been 2 pickups, 3-way pickup switch, and volume tone. That's always just been the bee's knees for me. Like depending on the pickups you use and everything, I just, these guys these days are plugging into so many effects pedals and,
Right.
your amp choice and all this other stuff. And, you know, I've just always been about that, just keep it simple kind of a thing. But, in terms of alternatives to that, other wiring diagrams, obviously there's three pickup combos that are fun. I do like the sound of a middle pickup usually more than any neck or bridge.
Hmm.
So that's always kind of like, if you have a middle pickup, I definitely always want to be able to have like that middle pickup by itself, isolated sound.
Mm.
Um, Beyond that, I'm a big fan of the. I think one of the questions in here spoke to this a little more specifically, but I'm a really big fan of that Jaguar Strangle switch. Just that little switch, two position switch that lets
Hmm.
you have your stock sound or that sound where it's sort of filtered through a capacitor and you get that really thin sound.
Oh,
It sounds very lo-fi and very like garage guitar,
is it
Um,
is there a cap there in that? I'm not
hmm
familiar with that schematic. Is that a cap in there, or is it actually changing the phase of the pickups?
It's a cap, yeah. So the way that it
Okay.
works basically is, if you could imagine the entire output of that lead section of the guitar before it heads over to your volume and tone pot. The you, your So basically you've got your two pickups and they each go to their own on-off switch and then they go to
Uh-huh.
the strangle switch. And so the way that works is there's a capacitor in line at all times.
In series. Yes.
And so what's happening is your signal's going through there. Your signal's always going through that capacitor. It's just that in one position of the switch, it's also going directly out.
Yeah.
But in the other position of the switch, it's only going through the capacitor.
Right.
So you get that just like thin sound, and it, depending on what
That's
value capacitor you use, you can get,
we're gonna
thin or
talk about
thin or
that
thinner.
later. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that later in the section on
Yeah.
capacitors and tone pots. But that's basically that's a high pass
hmm
then, right?
Yeah, high
Yeah.
pass filter. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, I tried to wire a guitar once, and I don't know that I think I needed to mess with capacitor values a little bit more to really perfect the circuit. But it worked. It just kind of wasn't as like effective as I wanted it to be. But I
Yeah.
had three switches, and one of them was meant to be a low pass. Then I had a band pass, and then a high pass. Like so,
Yeah.
the idea was
Cool.
that like you could kind of select, if you wanted a big bass, middle, or thin hump, you know,
Yeah.
which would have been fun, but it needed some tweaking still. But it was
Yeah,
cool,
definitely.
fun
I've
experiment.
I've got my I've got my pickup electronics tester guitar set up with a variety of capacitors sort of pre-wired into the circuit,
hmm
and so they're all connected to one lead that goes into the to the ground, and then the other lead can be alligator clipped on one of the three
hmm
um, for three values, and I think I have 0.001, 0.022, and 0.047. So I can test that type of stuff. Yeah,
hmm
because definitely, I mean, that's definitely a very simple way of doing it. There are other
hmm
kind of cooler ways. I've seen some people set up um, like a test card where it's just like literally a note card with a whole
hmm
bunch of capacitors glued to it, and you just reach up with your alligator clips and you clip into each one of those.
hmm Oh
Um,
yeah, sure. There you go.
some of the more high tech ones actually take one of those rotary switches,
hmm
5 or 6 position rotary switches, and which is what a variac is.
Yeah, or a
Um,
rheostat.
yeah, yeah, and just having different caps all along that different switching radius there.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, definitely playing with cap values is something that you can mess with,
Yeah.
and that's something that you can, in terms of a mod, just swapping out cap values.
hmm
Also, we're going to talk later about pot values as well, swapping out your just the resistance of your volume and tone pots can have an overall effect on things.
hmm
Um, what were some have you ever wired something up that you thought was going to be cool but wasn't?
Oh, for me, in those instances, it's always the humbucker coil taps or the humbucker in out of phase switching or the like, you know, swapping the series parallel, I think it is, with the two single
Hmm.
coils,
Hmm.
all that stuff. Like it sounds cool when you talk about it, and it seems like, there's always like potential for maybe some kind of a cool sound or whatever, but it just never, for me personally, and I mean, I know like a lot of guys, isn't that like the Peter Green sound or something?
Yes,
Is
yeah,
like the
it's the
like out of phase humbuckers in the
yeah,
middle
yeah,
position or something. You know what I mean? Like, so there's people that make use of it, and it's cool. But for me, none of those things just ever work. I mean, I've done them a bunch for people where they're like, "Can you put a push pull pot on this,
yeah,
bridge pickup for me or whatever?" Like, they want these mods done, and so I'll do it. And for that, I just go and I download a diagram and follow it,
right.
because again, I have a hard time figuring that stuff out on my own. But um, yeah, they just, those sounds just never really do anything for me.
Right. I heard a cool interview with Brian May,
Hmm.
and he was talking about his his guitar, that
Hmm.
original guitar that he built
I think
with
it's
his
actually
dad.
called like a space control center. I'm pretty sure it's that thing converts into a spaceship. And that's why he's an astrophysicist. I mean, it's,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I'm pretty sure he's going to take that thing off into outer space
It'll be
someday.
the next thing that gets sent to Mars
Yeah.
instead of instead of
Oh, that would be so cool.
instead of Elon Musk's car.
Yeah.
But he was talking about all those, because it's got three pickups and he's got all those on-off switches, and then he's also got um, some phase switching on
Hmm.
there too. And he was talking about how he uses those pickups, and he was saying is like, yeah, I've got this one switch. I can't remember where it was. It was something like the neck in the middle out of phase or something like that. And he's like, yeah, I used that on this one solo for this one song.
Oh God. Yeah.
And that's it. And that's
Yep.
it. Like their
Hmm.
entire repertoire. He's got this
Hmm.
one. So yeah, so I've did that on a guitar, with it was a two humbuckers with a three-way toggle, and I put the middle position out of phase. And I've had some people play it and they're like, "Oh, that's really cool."
Hmm.
Um, but you know, is that going to be something that somebody wants all the time? You know, I think when it comes to mods and stuff like that, you also just need to ask yourself a question like, how much do I use? If you've got a five-way switch on your guitar,
Hmm.
how much do you use the other for?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's, I mean, when I was a kid, I had this, cheap Korean Strat copy that had single humbucker. I almost never went out of the humbucking position with,
Hmm.
the tone pot opened
Hmm.
up all the way. And I mean, that definitely influenced everything I did after that. Um, but yeah, I pretty much always just
Yeah.
use
Yeah.
bridge position, just everything wide open. And so you have to ask yourself that question: how much am I going to use all these other things? I mean, they'd be cool, wire it up, solder it up, plug it in. You're like, yeah, that sounds cool. But then, leave it there for a month and find out how many times do you actually go to that
Yeah.
position and
Yeah.
be like, yes, this is inspiration for this new song and this new melody, this new solo, something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so. And I think additionally, you have to consider it from a design standpoint, because once you start adding all these extra switches, extra, push pull pots, extra, if you've got to create entire panels just to house, your kill switches and your push buttons and your whatever,
yeah,
like how much real estate is that going to take up on the guitar, and how goofy is it going to look when it's done?
right.
You know what I mean? Like there's all these old, just fantastically cool junky Japanese guitars from the 80s, and the 60s and stuff, that were just switches everywhere, like all the old Teiscos, and they had these cool rocker switches and everything. And some of that stuff's really fun, and it can be really really cool, but it becomes a thing. It becomes, this whole aesthetic, right,
Mhm.
of
Yeah,
the space control center,
right,
of
right.
like the sci-fi futuristic guitar of the, next millennium. um, Whereas, you know, if you're going real simple, if you do Telecaster style wiring, or, you know, Les Paul Jr. or whatever, one pickup, volume tone, call it good, that kind of thing. That is this very understated, very simple look, and it's a different look, you know. So you have to kind of ask yourself those design questions as well, because, you know, a huge variety of tones coming straight from your guitar is really cool, you know, but is it also distracting compared to just plug in and play?
Yeah. And also it kind of comes to some general philosophy about instrument use, and that is, do you have one guitar that, you know, does it all? Or do you have a variety of guitars that each have their own character, and you pick them up when you want to do that thing?
Yeah, and I think that comes down more to like the player, you know, in terms of what they want to get out of the instrument, and, you know, how, you know, whether they're a huge nerd and they have to have lots and lots of guitars, or whether they just want the one, you know. But
yeah, as guitar builders, of course, we hope that we are doing something that can support people's illness of guitar acquisition syndrome, and so maybe keep it simple and like encourage people to just buy more.
There you go. Best strategy. Case closed.
Case closed.
All right, Jason, do you think that we stumbled through that one sufficiently enough?
I think so.
I think we got that. Well, by all means, listeners, you know, from time to time, we wonder if we're entirely correct on things, and if you feel like you have a correction for us, send it in. Email us at theluthierist@gmail.com, and if you have something to correct us on, by all means, you know, we'll read it on the show. We want to make sure that you guys are getting the right information here. So.
And we are not too proud to admit we are full of shit.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. You know, we do our best to research and to just bring some experience to the table here, but hey, no one's perfect. All right, so moving on, the sort of next topic we've got here, we're going to go ahead and do capacitors and tone pots. So this is where we're going to kind of try to get into some nitty gritty on those.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Great. We got, so there's starting up top here, we've got Wessel Guitars on Instagram asks, I want to know how to roll your own tone caps, or maybe I'd rather hear what are some favorite tone caps.
I'm wondering because there were two posts probably within a day of each other. The first post I saw on Instagram was Scott Walker. Scott Walker rolls his own tone caps, and he does that with some hemp cigarette paper. Oh, wow. And a foil. I'm not sure what kind of foil he uses. And then those are, I mean, he's creating his own paper and oil caps, which are ancient technology in terms of capacitors. And so that's hemp paper and then soaked in hemp oil, and I think then that they're sealed up in wax, and then he puts his own cool label on them there. So I'll admit it, I saw him do that, and I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna go try that. So I went out. So I saw this like first thing in the morning, and I like went out. So you took up smoking, and then right? No, I went out in the shop in my robe, you know, in my slippers, and I grabbed some just some masking tape, and, you know, grabbed a roll of aluminum foil out of the drawer in the kitchen and went out there and tried doing this. And so the simplest, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube about how to make your own tone caps, from a rolled one to just a simple two thin sheets that are just taped together. But the anatomy of a capacitor is two some sort of electrical sheets, some kind of electrical contacts that are separated by a gap. And it is that gap that creates this little electric charge. Capacitor is basically like a very, very tiny and very short-lived battery that in most electronic applications is is meant to be sort of a moderator of current. When you don't want current to fluctuate too much, a capacitor can kind of create a buffer so that you don't have these huge oscillations, because it can store up a little bit of electricity and release it when the voltage goes down, and whatever your application is that you don't want that to be all over the place, that can help out that. Of course, in a guitar though, it's a filter. Used as a filter.
Right. So just for my information, so because I know that a resistor takes an electrical current coming in and does kind of, as its name implies, it sort of resists the current, and it doesn't allow all of the current to go through, right? And so then what comes out on the other end is less current.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know what happens to all that extra current. It just doesn't. It just like, I don't know. So you're saying it dissipates this heat? Okay, that makes sense. So you're saying that a capacitor kind of does the same thing, but instead of like more or less electrical current coming out, it just makes it so that on the other side the signal is consistent? Like it absorbs spikes and releases more when needed?
Sort of.
Is that kind of right?
That's my very, very basic. Like I saw when I was reading up on it, I saw an example. So you've got your clock radio beside your bed, right? There are capacitors in there that if you have a little quick power outage that we sometimes get, not like a tree falls on your power line and takes it out for a day or two, but when you get those little blips, brownouts, the capacitor keeps things running in your clock just enough to allow your time to continue without dropping. Of course, some of them have backup batteries, but there are also there's capacitors in there. Another one I read about is in microprocessors. You don't want fluctuations in current to be resetting things constantly. So we've got 110, but it's like 110 plus or minus a little bit, and so whatever the voltage coming in, it sort of moderates it a bit.
Wow. Okay. All right. That just expanded my knowledge of capacitors quite a bit more. Okay, but as you were saying, in a guitar circuit, the capacitor acts as a filter.
It acts as a filter, right? So it's so winding your wrapping your own, rolling your own is a pretty simple thing, really. What you get out of it and what type of conductive surfaces that you're using, whether it's aluminum foil or copper, I think probably has something to do with it. How wide the gap is, Scott Walker's using that really fine cigarette paper, hemp cigarette paper. That's just, it's like tissue. You can see right through it kind of thing. So that narrows that gap across there. And then how long the strip is before you roll it up has something to do with your resulting capacitance on there. It's fairly simple and fairly old technology, and you can roll them all you want. But I guess the next question is like, what are some of your favorite tone caps? I guess the question really is like, can you hear the difference between them? And I don't know. I really don't have an opinion on that. I've read some things that just say like we're talking about a really simple piece of hardware here, and they all do the same thing. Right. So you're not going to be able to hear the difference. There's in sort of industrial applications, I think there's a difference because some of those capacitors have a shorter and longer life. Like I've read that the oil or the paper and oil capacitors have they actually have a shorter life. Their value can go down over time as those conductive surfaces corrode or whatever, or as the whatever that gap material is and decays over time. So I think in some situations, yes, capacitors are going to matter what kind whether you're using a a paper and oil or a mylar or a ceramic. A lot of things that I've read it, say in a guitar circuit, you're not going to hear the difference. It's the value that's going to make the difference. The type of material it's made out of is not going to. I don't know. What is your experience, Paul? I don't know.
Well, yeah. So for the most part, I'd say I don't hear a ton of difference between your mylar caps, your paper and oil caps, your orange drop caps. I don't know what those are, what they're made out of. I think those are probably a mylar as well, but it's a different type of mylar.
Yeah.
Or maybe those are the mylar. The other one I'm thinking of is polypropylene, I think.
And there's the ceramic ones that actually have that.
That's
that little
that's what I was
surface.
going to say. Is the ceramic one is the one that I feel like I can hear a difference.
Oh.
Because I have experience with switching from one to the other. I don't want to go into too much detail about when and where that experience was, but there was just a lot of guitars that had orange drop caps and then switched over to the ceramic caps. And I'm not much of a tone pot user. I never was.
Yeah.
But when I did start to learn the value of a tone pot, what it can do for your sound and for your playing, I started using it more and appreciating what it can do. And I was always really happy with the tone pot on these guitars. And then they switched over to ceramic caps, and instantly I felt like I just didn't care for the way the tone pot sounded. So I do feel like I can hear a difference with those. Between the paper and oil, the mylar, polypropylene, all these whatever, those good quality caps, that are usually a lot bigger. Those things, yeah, I can't really hear any difference. I always use the polypropylene, the little like Mallory, I think is like the common name. Cornell Dubilier is, I think, the trade name. Company that makes them. I think they come from Mouser. They're about like 75 cents a piece, maybe $1.75. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And the tolerance on those things, that's another thing that you have to take into consideration with capacitors, just the tolerance, whether it's, plus or minus 5%, plus minus 10%, plus minus
the manufacturing
whatever.
Tolerances.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's why I always went with the polypropylene, because the tolerance was within 5%. It's just a much, stricter tolerance.
That's a really good thing to know about.
Yeah, as opposed to, some of these others, like the ceramics, I think are 10%, so that's another thing that you have to consider, because you will hear a difference if your cap is off spec.
Yeah.
So yeah, going with a higher tolerance is, I think, a really good thing. Rolling your own, that's, if you've got the wherewithal to go ahead and experiment with that, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you basically just take a lead, solder it to one end of a long strip of a conductive material, a copper or an aluminum or whatever, some kind of conductive metal, right? Long, really thin strip. And then you solder a lead to the other end, and then you take a layer of something really thin, your paper or I would suppose, as the name implies, polypropylene, mylar, whatever you want, and then you literally roll it. Yeah. And you just roll it as tightly as you can, right? And then you create that barrel, and you get your two leads coming out of opposite ends.
It's each strip. There's two strips of metal.
Oh, there's two.
One barrier
not one continuous.
Yeah, no, it's two strips of metal, barrier of paper in between, leads either just soldered or pressed into that metal. Then it's rolled up, and so it's the two surfaces.
There's a gap between the two.
Yes, okay, that is the capacitor. That is creating that little electrostatic charge between the two.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know that if you have the wherewithal to make your own, I think the challenge is going to be nailing specific values,
consistency,
nailing specific tolerances. Right. If you do want to do that, I would say have a goal in mind and focus on that, and try to figure out exactly how to make that specific capacitance and then figure out how to do it consistently.
Right.
Those are going to be your keys.
Yeah, the one that I made it ended up when I plugged it into my my test rig, it was a very, very low value. It was hardly noticeable at all. It just barely clipped off the highs. But I think that was also had something to do with the I was using masking tape as the barrier between, which is kind of bulky and ended up creating sort of a large gap. I think the smaller your gap, the better off you are. But I think that's actually one way that capacitors are tuned, is that you change the size of that gap in there. So it's part of it's the length that if you're rolling it in a barrel-shaped ones, it's the length of your conductive strips, but also that gap. What is the gap in there? But it's I'm glad that you said that you had some experience about the different sounds that you get out of them, and maybe tolerance is where it's all coming down to.
Perhaps.
I heard. I think people are either on one side of the fence or the other on this issue. I was in, just a quick story here. I was in the shop of let's just say a veteran luthier who builds guitars for some pretty high profile players, and I caught him at the end of the day, and he was finishing up some business, and he had called up one of his part suppliers, and he was ordering some parts and stuff like that, and he says, "Hey, do you have any of those big fat capacitors? Those paper oil style ones?" He's like, yeah, they're new, yeah. How much are they a piece? $25 a piece. Geez, okay. Well, they look good in a control cavity, and people geek out over them, So give me 3 of those. So he was totally not purchasing these capacitors based on anything but they looked cool when somebody pulled off, whoever pulled off their control cavity, they were gonna just be these fat old school looking things, and people were gonna think, "Ooh, this is cool."
Yeah. Well, yeah, you got to be aware of imposters out there. I mean, I've definitely seen where people took paper and just made like a neat little sticker and then just wrapped it around a polypropylene cap, and just called it a paper and oil. It's like it happens, and I don't think that kind of thing happens too often, but like I said, I think between the good quality capacitors, I can't really hear a difference, and I don't know that there's really any reason to spend a ton of money on those things, but for my money, those polypropylene Mallory caps are they're great.
Yeah It's part of it has to do with what kind of look you want under the hood. Part of it has to do with how much when you're really parsing out components in terms of your overall costs and things, how much you want to pay for those.
Sometimes your customer might care.
Yeah. So once we now that we've sort of identified what a capacitor is, like, what do you do with it then? And how does it actually work in your signal chain? So we were talking about values, not tolerances, but values, the capacitance values there. So and you were talking about needing to go through some different values to kind of fine tune a particular sound that you were looking for. So how do you do that? Well, you kind of start with kind of some typical values that are out there. So 0.022 microfarad cap is kind of considered standard. 0.001 microfarad cap is a lower value, and that's some people like that in some applications. Treble bleed sometimes is a place where you use a smaller cap like that. And then a higher value would be a 0.047 microfarad. And so just kind of understand how that works out. So when you put a cap on a typical tone pot, you're putting that in parallel with the signal. So you've got your hot lead going straight to to the coming off the volume and going to the tip of your jack, and then you've got other grounds happening coming off of everything, your control cavity if it's grounded, your pickup grounds, your bridge grounds, all of these grounds happening. And then so in parallel means it's going along with some of these, not directly in line, but side by side. That's parallel, I guess you could call it, side by side with the ground signal that's going to the shield of your jack. And so this in this application, you're creating that low pass. So in other words, it's rolling off the highs and it's allowing the lows to go through. That's when you roll on your tone pot. You get more of that boomy, bassy sound, more of that muffled sound. So just altering the cap size there can really determine how your tone capacitor is going to be affecting your sound. So one way to think of it is think about how the values affect it. So put your hand in front of you like this. Everybody can see this in the radio land there. So let's say you're just like flat hand in front of you, right? So let's say that this is your frequency response, and everything above your hand up towards your head is your high, and everything down below is the low sounds, obviously. So let's say that right where you are, maybe you've got it right at about neck or chest level. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a 0.022 microfarad, your average cap, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you roll it off, everything above that is going to disappear, or gradually disappear, and everything below that is going to remain, right? So if you go with a higher value, so let's say you're going to raise your hand now, maybe that your hand is now at forehead level or something like that. There's going to be more low getting passed through, right? So there's more space under your hand now. So you have more, and there's going to be fewer highs remaining. So if you have now a lower value, so now you're dropping your hand, maybe you're down at chest level or so. So you can see now that there's more space above your hand, less space below your hand. So there's going to be more highs getting through and fewer lows passing through. Okay. So that's if you want to think about it that way. So if you're finding that when you're rolling off your tone, if you're finding that it just gets too boomy, too bassy, too fast, dropping that value a bit is going to it's going to allow more of those highs to pass through at any point along the roll off on your tone capacitor there. And so that's something that you can do to play with different sounds. Different caps have been used in different schemes throughout the years. Going back to those early Telecasters, I think those had a 0.05, and so that was really chopping off the highs fast. And even in those early Telecasters, there was actually there was a 0.05 microfarad cap in the switch for the neck position. So first position was bridge. Second position was neck. Third position was neck with this capacitor in parallel. So you actually had a position that completely muffled out your tone, and it was it was a stylistic kind of thing. You could be on this, boom, 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 and you flick your switch and you go to lead, and it's more crisp and clean.
Can we have a podcast where you make those sound effects for like 15 minutes? I think that I actually have a similar circuit. Now that I think about it, I think I must have the same or some similar circuit on my Supro. That's a one pickup guitar, but in the middle, it's got a 3-way switch, and in the middle position, it sounds like the pickup is kind of wide open, like unaffected. On one side, it must be a really low value capacitor because it's all highs. It just, it's a high pass thing. But then on the other side, it's all lows. It turns to a jazz guitar sound. You know what I mean? It must be that same circuit that they put in the Telecaster. Where it's muffling it out like that. It's really cool.
Yeah, and that's a going back to the idea of mods and stuff like that. You can put those. So the low pass is in parallel, and as we talked about earlier with that strangle switch, you put a cap in series, so now it's in line with the hot.
Mm-hmm.
You are creating a high pass filter, and so you're chopping out the lows. And actually, so there's Fender has this thing called the TBX tone control, and it's a stacked pot, and on one of them, it's got a center detent on it, and you roll it one way, and it's your standard type of tone pot that's rolling off the highs. You roll it the other way, and it's rolling off the lows. It's a treble. Cool. The treble circuit. Yeah. So that right there, that's some cool stuff you can do. You basically get that same effect that you're talking about there with your Supro switch.
Mm-hmm. That's
but
neat. I like that.
You can dial it in there.
Sweet.
And then when I was learning about the difference between what happens with series versus parallel, I was playing around with my test guitar, and I've got a really cheap humbucker in there that I pulled off of some junk guitar, and I was putting the caps in different places in the circuit and stuff, and I got to thinking, well, what would happen if you put it in the middle of the humbucker pickup? So we'll get into this later, maybe a little bit talking about winding pickups, but a humbucker is 2 coils, and the thing that makes it humbucking is that the magnets are opposite, but then also the coil circuit direction is opposite, so it cancels out any interference from electromagnetic and radio frequency and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you have one coil that is wired from finish to start, and it connects to the other coil start to finish. And so as the path of the electricity goes through there, you're getting these opposite directions in the coils, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, put a cap in parallel in between that. Mm-hmm. So you go over to your series connection, which is, depending on what wiring you're looking at, could be the white and the red, and you solder a cap onto that.
Yeah.
What you end up with is, inside of one pickup, you end up with one coil getting the low pass, the other coil getting the high pass.
Whoa.
And so you end up with this very sort of mid-scoopy kind of sound. And
whoa, crazy.
And you can vary the effect of that, of course, with different values of capacitors. So I'm building an 8-string that's got one pickup on it, and I thought about, like, what can I do with one pickup to make some interesting things going on. And so it's just one 5-way switch. It's actually a super switch, so it's got more terminals on it, so you can do more combos. So it's a 5-way switch going straight to the volume. And on that 5-way switch, the first position is going to be just the pickup straight to volume. Second position is going to be the high pass, so in series. Third position is going to be that capacitor in between the coils, so it's going to be that mid scoop. Fourth position is going to be the low pass in parallel, and fifth position I'm probably going to do like just a coil cut, so just like one coil. So instead of a 5-way being really a pickup selector, it's one pickup. It's more like a tone selector.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's some cool stuff that you can do with just changing the location of the cap in your signal chain within the guitar itself. But I mean,
That was the sound of my head exploding.
yeah. Aside from the I mean, obviously putting that cap in between the coils. Obviously, the high pass and the low pass, that's all been done before in different ways, either with the actual tone control or with putting it right into the switching path there to get those immediate sounds of something being rolled one way or the other. So I'm not really reinventing everything here. It's just kind of like I don't know. My hope is that it's going to be an interesting and useful circuit. It could be back to our earlier conversation of like it seemed cool, but not anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, there's always a lot of options with it.
I like it. I think for my money, messing with capacitors is more interesting than the series parallel phase stuff
Yeah,
on
yeah.
pickups. That's just me. Um, Fantastic information. So we have one more question in this section,
Hmm.
and then we're moving on to the next session, which will be about winding pickups. From Instagram, Ryan, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this last
I think
name.
it's probably Siquiera.
Siquiera asks, does the resistance of a tone pot even matter? Is the difference between a 500K and 250K pot even audible, or does taper matter more than resistance?
Hmm.
What do you think? I don't know. I tell you what I had been doing for a pretty long time
Okay.
with my circuits was a 500K on the volume and a 250K on the tone.
Mhm.
Um, with a 22 microfarad
Hmm.
capacitor, because I thought to my ear that sounded to me like uh, the tone pot didn't roll off too much on the highs.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So it's like it's a low pass filter still, like it does
Hmm.
function that way, but it's not super muddy.
Yeah.
That was how I was doing it. What do you think? What's your experience? And
I've only used 500Ks on my guitars for both circuits, so that's something I still have to play around with.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I'll be honest with you, I'm using 500Ks because most of my guitars are double humbucker, um, and that's just kind of what's been done. And going back to it's like why do we even have different value you know tone pots in guitar use, and it's goes back to kind of what was done at the beginning. And so Fender was putting 250Ks in there, and Gibson was putting 500Ks in there.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so just like what again, going back to the original question, what's the effect of that overall? A higher value um, tone pot is going to allow your signal to be brighter, just in general.
Yeah.
And so on those Fenders, a 250K, single coils can be pretty bright. That sort of loads up. With using a 250K, it kind of just generally dulls things a bit. With the humbuckers have a tendency to have a darker sound than a single coil,
Mm-hmm.
just because of the geometry and the just how the pickup is constructed. So you might want a little bit brighter sound overall, to let more highs go through. Of course, none of that explains the 1 meg pots that were used in the Jazz Masters, which you're talking about some strident pickups with some pots that are going to allow it all to go through. So what's your experience? You love Jazz Masters. What's your experience with
Yeah,
that?
I do love Jazz Masters, and I mean, I think I really like the 1 meg pots, and I've been very tempted to revisit them with future guitar designs and future wiring schematics, and kind of like get back to seeing if maybe that might be where the ticket is at. Because yeah, I mean, it lets more highs through, so it's a little bit more of a direct to output kind of a sound, which I really like. I love that sort of like super wide open sound.
Hmm.
Um, but you that's what a tone pot can be great for, is to roll
Hmm.
off some of those highs and make it not sound quite so wide open. So that's what's
Right.
cool about a Jazzmaster. And I wonder if like maybe the reason why they did that was because those Jazzmaster pickups they're so wide, you know, they can be very bright, but they can
Hmm.
also be, but they're darker sounding than,
Hmm.
you know, your Strat pickups. So I
Hmm.
wonder if maybe, you know, when they're designing the thing, they think, oh, well, these pickups sound really dark. There's like just too much, it's too dark with 250K pots.
Yeah.
So let's go to a higher pot value to let some more highs through, you know, and they ended up going all the way up to 1 meg,
Yeah.
which you know, some might argue might be too far, but I don't think so. I really like that sound. I think the Jazzmaster and Jaguars, I think, have the 1 meg pot in the one position as well.
Now
And
remind me. Here's another factor. Is it the Jazzmaster or the Jaguar that has the shorter scale?
the Jaguar.
Okay, because a shorter scale instrument is going to, in general, in comparison with a longer scale instrument, going to have a more mellow tone as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that was also something to compensate for that.
Right, and Jaguar pickups are interesting because they're those narrow single coils, but they
Mhm.
have that extra claw on it
Right,
that really sort of reorients the magnetic field in a
right.
very different way I'm not quite well equipped enough to explain, but it does, and it definitely darkens up the tone. I played this vintage Jaguar one time that had just like the snarliest,
Hmm.
totally just like brutal sound. Like this
Yeah.
guitar would like wanted to play metal. Like it sounded heavy, you know what I mean? Like even in like the clean tone and everything, it just had this just like grit and grunt to it. And it's just this
Mhm.
little Jaguar with a little single
Yeah.
coil pick, you know what I mean? It was incredible. And I think that a lot of them are like that. And so yeah, I think those had the 1 meg pots as well. I'm really into that sound, and I really like the idea of, let's make this guitar just where you can get all the treble you want out of it. You can get all the wide open sound that you want out of it. And
Hmm.
then if it's too much, well, you have a tone pot right there. You can dial it
Right,
back. You know what I
right.
mean? I'm really into that as a sort of aesthetic, and I think for me personally, I want to explore that more. And I think that it's very cool, and you know, I would love to see more people kind of like getting into it and going for it. You know.
Yeah. I on my first guitar, the pickups I built, and which is what got me into winding in the first place, um, it they're extremely dark.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of steel in them, um, and when I was on one of our favorite forums, the MIMF, the Musical Instrument Makers Forum, I was complaining about that. I was saying like, well, it's pretty muffled. There's not a lot of string separation. It's this very kind of just muddy tone. One of the first um, questions that somebody asked was, well, what value are your pots on that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe you want to try going up to a 1 meg on that to see if that gives you a little bit more headroom.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's something that I still might experiment with on that guitar in particular, because it's my own. It's
Mm-hmm.
I can go under the hood and make it ugly if necessary. But it was that was the first thing that really turned me on to, like, oh, maybe this is like, it's not just, you don't just go with what is normal or what is
Yeah.
considered traditional. On the other hand, um, I've seen some discussion on some forums about people taking their jazz masters and going back to a 250K pot
Oh,
because
sure. Yeah.
because they were like, oh, this is too much.
Yeah,
And they wanted to really ratchet back
for
that
sure.
jangly sparkliness. And so I mean, it's all of that comes down to personal preference, really.
But you got to
That's
keep a couple of other things in mind, like with people that are seeking a darker tone out of their guitar. Sometimes those people are plugging into, you know, a twin reverb or something like an amp that, or like those. I think it's like the Vox AC15 or whatever. That's like, it's a bright amp. You know what I mean?
right.
Like it's an amp that is not holding back any of your,
Mm-hmm.
your tone. And so with an amp that's so super wide open like that, if you're plugging in uh, single coils and 1 meg pots and everything like that, yeah, like you're gonna hear all that jangle. You're gonna hear all that's
Right.
what that's like the Birds, the Peter Gwynn, the famous the Rickenbacker jangle sound. You know what I mean? It's
Uh-huh.
like Rickenbacker into the Vox AC13. It's like it's all jangle. It's all
Mm-hmm.
treble. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, that's the sound that they like. But for a lot of people, if you're playing blues, if you're playing rock, a lot of the times you want more of that brown sound, that deeper, darker tone.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if you like the Jazzmaster sound, but it's too bright, that's definitely like an easy way to do it. You can change your pots, or you can buy a new amp, and pots is a lot cheaper.
Right.
So there's that, and then I also think that with pots, it's the same as capacitors with the tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of people with buying a brand new Japanese or Indonesian, even Mexican-made Fender with the cheap pots. They come
Mm-hmm.
with those ceramic capacitors and those really tiny little pots that are, you know, uh, they're the lower quality pots. And
Right.
even though technically on a stick a multimeter on it, it's just a variable resistor, and it's the same resistance as your CTS pots or whatever. um you can hear a tonal difference, and I think a lot of that probably has to do with the tolerances, because I think that a lot of those cheaper pots just don't have the high tolerance of a good pot. And so that's an easy mod for people to do, is to just swap out their stock electronics with better quality components, and
Mm-hmm.
you get a better sound that way. So
Mm-hmm.
I think in some cases that's really like should be the first thing that you do to a guitar, is experiment with those, the pots and capacitors, because you don't necessarily have to change pickups or whatever. If the guitar already has uh, decent pickups and an output jack that's not going to break on you immediately,
Yeah.
there you go.
That's part of kind of a bigger topic of dialing in the sound that you want, or trying to improve or change or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is a lot of times people go straight to the pickups, um, and that's not always the first place that you want to go. I mean, definitely you're probably going to get a dramatic change in sound, whether it's the sound that you're looking for or not. But there are subtle things that you can do under the hood, in your signal chain, but it's a part of it. It really requires that you understand what something is going to do. It's like, if
Mm-hmm.
I change this, what's it actually going to do? What should I expect in the sound that I'm going to hear? Um, but yeah, there's as simple as, well, I mean, relatively speaking, as simple as a guitar circuit is, there are little subtle things that can have noticeable differences, without it being a really expensive kind of upgrade or switch out of,
Mm-hmm.
of components or something like that. There was at the end of Ryan's question here, he was asking about taper.
Yeah.
Um, Generally, I think audio taper is what's used in guitar components,
Mm-hmm.
and that just has to do with, it's the perception of how fast a pot will affect your sound, either with volume or with tone. And a linear taper, it's gonna seem like a smaller turn off of zero is going to have a bigger effect than an audio taper.
Mm-hmm.
Audio taper is going to feel like there's a little bit more a gradual, as you go towards the five position. It's going to seem like there's a little bit more of a gradual change, rather than an audio, which is, you're going to start hearing in the 2 to 3 position. You're going to hear some kind of dramatic effects in the roll off of volume, or the roll off of tone right
Mm-hmm.
away. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know that I have a whole ton of experience to speak to on that, but I think you can hear a difference between
Mm-hmm.
audio versus
Yeah.
linear taper pots
Mm-hmm.
if you're paying real close attention, if you're really like comparing. Um, and I think then it just would probably come down to preference if you actually
Yeah.
have, one over the other. Audio is definitely standard, and 99% of guitars are going to have, your audio taper
Right.
all throughout. But I think that there probably are situations where linear taper is quite nice and maybe desirable.
Yeah. The only thing that I can really think of is, I mean, both are going to give you somewhere on their turn,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to give you the same resistance values.
Mm-hmm.
Either the roll off or the tone or the roll off of the volume.
Mm-hmm.
The only place I can really think of that would be you'd want one or the other is if you are a player who uses your volume in your in your playing
Oh,
style.
sure. Yeah.
So if you're the type of person who reaches down and I don't know, an extreme example I guess would be doing the sort of the volume swells
Yeah,
with the
with
pinky
the
with the
pinky.
pinky
Yeah.
roll,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, which is really cool. You're probably going to want an audio taper there because otherwise a linear taper is probably going to make it sound, instead of like a swelling kind of sound, it would probably sound more like an open and shut kind of thing going on. And even if you like to just back off the volume to clean up the sound a little bit, if you're doing that in the middle of your playing and you're reaching down and you just nudge it with your pinky, you want a I think an audio taper has a little bit more of an intuitive kind of result when you turn it.
Mm-hmm.
um, and and um, turning it to 2 or 3 on an audio taper is going to be different than turning it to 2 or 3 on a linear taper. So that's something that it may either completely matter or completely not. I mean, if you're the person who is just like, I plug in, I turn the volume all the way up, I play.
Right.
Between songs, I turn the volume all the way down. It might not matter at all. And you just so that's little subtle things that you might need to experiment with on your own.
Absolutely.
Definitely find out what your customer's playing style prefers.
All right, everyone, that is the end of part 1. I think we have talked your ear off long enough for this week, but we will be back next week with part 2 of our electronics Q&A show. Thank you so much for listening to the Luthiers podcast. If you would like to support the show, we have a link for that in the podcast description. Every little bit counts. We hope you do that. And that's it for this week. Thank you. Okay, bye.